Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I want to turn quickly, please, to my scene set, which is an example of a project which, as you will all be aware, was private sector-led investment undertaken really at the best possible time to undertake high-risk development, and a scheme which I would suggest, with all due apology to Peter, sets a standard in providing a home for the beautiful game. I also want to make the observations that 60,000 seater stadium of this sort are obviously very difficult to develop even in very good times. And in addition to obviously the stadium development itself, many of you will be aware that this scheme secured the upgrading of significant public transport requirements. There were part requirements of the team at TfL, the relocation of a waste transfer site, a number of other very substantial public and other properties that needed to be addressed at the time, and also a host of Section 106 related requirements, which were clearly very expensive to deal with. The point that's really of interest to me here is that in 2002-2003, when the business planning work was undertaken, this project was one which could be undertaken through a combination of enabling development, and the enabling development is continuing, as many of you will be aware, as you go up and have a look at the area around the Emirates Stadium. The naming rights, which were sold for substantial sums of money, and as you can see, that speaks for itself. And of course, the critical component to this was the £260 million bond that was secured against future revenues, in something of a similar way to the way in which has just been referred to by Matthew in his presentation. In these more austere and difficult economic and financial times, we need new financial models. We can't work in the way that we used to do, where we look, as other speakers have said this morning, at planning gain being the solution to delivering major and complex infrastructure projects, either for the public or for the private, or for public and private sectors together. In recent months, you will have seen extensive coverage in the regeneration media of TIF, tax incremental finance, based ideas. Many of these ideas are evolving ideas. Tax incremental finance is a model which we are looking at very closely in the UK in a variety of settings, and one's just been referred to in Battersea, and it does have many of its genesis from the projects which have been successfully completed over very many years in the US, and we've been working closely with colleagues at DLA Piper to look at how some of the lessons from the US can be imported in looking at best practice in the UK. Some of you will have made initial expressions of interest to DCLG, and in the latter part of my presentation I'll come back to the strength of the interest that was expressed at that time. In the short time available, I will confirm what, in the simplest form, I would suggest a TIF scheme comprises, and we can debate some of the alternative models that have been looked at more latterly, update you on prospective pilot projects, and there are a number of very good ones that do deserve a quick review this morning, and make the case study for TIF on the eve of both the budget, which is now anticipated to be at the 24th of this month, and a general election which has been referred to earlier as being coming fairly shortly in May. So, at its simplest level, what is a TIF? The easiest definition I could try to come up with for this morning's purposes is to summarise it as a method of forward funding infrastructure investment by borrowing against projected tax revenues, and we'll come back if you like to that component, created by new property development. It may be helpful to show it in a slightly simplified version, where we have local authority primary investment, initiating the development process by primary investment, although that doesn't have to be the case, and some of the models we're looking at funding infrastructure in a different public-private combination. Private and public sector development obviously being successfully secured off of the back of the funding of that infrastructure, and then the incremental tax revenues arising off of the back of the new development which has been successfully secured. TIFs are not the only option open to us. As you will be aware, bonds are also being discussed, and have seen fairly recent press coverage of a variety of bond-related solutions, again largely being imported from the US. The US bond models are both municipal and local government, and they're commonplace. However, ultimately these have to be underwritten by secure revenue and some form of guarantee or pledge, which is clearly a challenge for some public sector organisations who may be looking at bond-related opportunities. At a time of financial nervousness, I beg your pardon, bonds are not a clear-cut alternative, in my opinion. Many of you will be familiar also with PFI and PPP-related partnership schemes, and we may come back in a few minutes' time to TfL's view on PPP and its success in delivering improvement to the tube network. I'm not ignoring PFI and PPP, but clearly some of these relatively complex vehicles have come under financial scrutiny as of late. TIF has, at its simplest, the attraction of being entirely related to incremental tax arising from the development process. In other words, it can be a situation where there is no new tax and no lost tax to account for. And of course, once the development process has been completed and the infrastructure works have been fully financed, the Treasury will collect the full benefit of the TIF-related incremental tax. In looking at individual case study projects, the question we're looking at is that the underlying test is where, but for the TIF, the relevant tax revenues would not have arisen. The question we're then left with is, how and when will TIF-based projects be selected? As I've mentioned a moment or two ago, many of you will be fairly familiar with TIF or have looked at TIF in the context of the DCLG invitation last spring to make an expression of interest, and it was the English authorities that were targeted at that particular time, to make an expression of interest relating to an oven-ready project, a project which had already more or less got to the starting line. And the letter, which was fairly brief and which many of you will be familiar with, asked for a limited amount of initial information relating to how a TIF would be the difference between a scheme successfully proceeding and not proceeding. Some 120 expressions of interest were received at that time, and at CBRE we were involved with acting for both public and private sector developers who were looking at how TIF would make that essential difference to success. That number of expressions of interest equates to some 60% of local authorities in England, representing, I would suggest, a very substantial number, expressing a firm interest in a TIF-based development opportunity. And we know from the work that we were doing at the time that there were very many other local authorities who were interested in TIF, but didn't feel their projects were sufficiently oven-ready to be a credible pilot project. Let's turn briefly to a few case studies which I think are helpful in illustrating where this discussion has moved on to. North of the border, in Scotland, the Scottish Futures Trust, an agency of the Scottish Government, has entered into detailed discussion with a variety of prospective TIF-based candidates, and there are several good outline proposals which are now coming to shape. In North Lanarkshire, the Council is seeking to secure a £600 million Phase 2 regeneration of the Ravenscraig Steelworks. And here you can see both the pre-demolition and post-development master plans for Ravenscraig, and my colleagues Doug Smith and Virginia Beckett, who are working on this project, are in the audience today. Across in Edinburgh, not to be left behind, the City Council is working with Forth Ports to regenerate the Edinburgh waterfront. This comprises some 500 acres between Leith and Granton, and this will be secured, this second phase and further development at the Edinburgh waterfront will be secured, all being well, through a TIF-based development partnership. And that's what you'll see in sunny Leith today. The scheme, when it's completed, will continue to provide a better and improved and successful development context where you will find currently the Britannia moored, and in due course you'll find a successful tram link connecting the centre of Edinburgh and indeed the airport through to and down to the Edinburgh waterfront.